To kick things off, Nama, this might have been a better question for Brad, but I don't know how closely you've been following today's council agenda. Based on what we've seen in the recommended zoning bylaw amendment, official plan amendment for the major streets policy, what would you like to see amended before, I guess, it passes tonight?
From what I'm hearing from my clients, it's the site plan component. So remember I said everything above 10 needs site plan? If we could actually omit the site plan even from the 30 unit cap or the 60 unit cap, doesn't matter, and the city would have a very hard time to let the site plan part go. But if we could, I think this would unlock the viability way more even maybe than the 30 additional units. I mean, again, I didn't run a pro forma, but getting into site plan, it's a process. It's a technical process. The departments don't reply on time. You don't know what you are going to end up with as the moment you get in. So if the city could have even a descriptive, these are what you need to do, and we won't have site plan, I think it will have a really tremendous impact on the feasibility of that. Because even, you mentioned type G loading, and even today, I don't know if you know, and I don't know if you covered that, but it used to be 30 units was the cap. Now you could even exceed 30 for a specific review. So I think we really need this type of flexibility to pass site plan, and that's why I think the 10 unit with no approval and no site plan will be so desirable. If we could get it also for 30, that's what will really change your pro forma as well.
Got it. So yeah, increasing the threshold for site plan control to kick in.
Just so you know, no one is talking about it. Just don't get your expectations.
Yeah, sure.
They increased it to 60, but with the site plan.
Okay. Again, once again, if there are any questions, we'll do it down the middle. Vova will hold the mic. In the meantime, question for you, Stephen. Have you started talking to any regulators about this? What's the reaction? I mean, the reason why we're talking about it, of course, is because the projects at this scale, the margins are so tight that anything we could do to kind of move these items in our direction is helpful. So yeah, how's that been going if you've been having those conversations, and what might people do in Canada?
Yeah. So this was this presentation was based on a report that'll be released in about a month. I tried to talk to regulators. I didn't get a ton of interest. I have to admit, I did not speak to anyone in Canada. I will definitely be talking to people in Canada about it. I think in general, because the building code world is a very insular place. It's kind of like, imagine 20 years ago you start talking to someone about parking requirements and FSI, and their sort of eyes glaze over, and the people whose job it is are confused about why anyone would take an interest in it. So I think the field is the field of sort of critical research about building codes is very nascent. In general, in North America, I think in architecture there is not a strong emphasis in education on the technical details, in my opinion, of construction. And as such, if you're an ambitious creative thinker, your idea is not to go into code development. You want to do design. So one of my goals is to get younger architects thinking more about technical codes and standards, and that there is it's a more exciting place than it has been, I guess. So if you're interested, I mean, in the United States, there's the process for amending building codes is very insular. It's very confusing. People are not really involved in it. I have to concede I don't really know exactly how the process works in Canada. I believe you have the National Building Code of Canada, and then things filter down to the provinces. But I would say as an architect or developer, builder, whatever, if there's something you notice, if there's a new sprinkler requirement or new whatever, get in touch with me, or think about it, and if you want to be involved, you will be one of the more passionate people in the room, I think. There's not a lot of interest in it. There's not a lot of involvement. Historically, the materials manufacturers, the fire service have been the two major constituencies there, and neither of them really have an interest in bringing down cost. Neither of them really think about cost in a great way, in my opinion. In a lot of ways, the fire service thinks about cost as someone else's problem, and not as the thing standing between us and new buildings that are more fire safe. I don't have like an exact
Sure.
idea of how to get involved, but like if you see it, insert yourself into the process, I guess.
Yeah. Well, on that last point, it is ironic that a lot of these things that drive costs are kind of accessibility concerns, so like larger elevators. But the outcome is actually that we're building more buildings with no elevators at all. So it's kind of like counter to the intent. Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's this idea in the code world that like we're writing code for new buildings. The new buildings will be built regardless. So as long as I can win this fight with the developer association, then we will get the larger elevators. But like in reality, that's not how it works. In reality, if your 3-story building crosses a certain threshold and it requires an elevator, the developer might say, I'm just going to build a bunch of townhouses. And there's going to be no accessibility.
Yeah.
If somebody has, goes into cardiac arrest on the 3rd story, there's going to be no elevator to get them out. So yeah, I don't think the people who develop these codes really think about it in the right way, frankly. Like it's not just, people who are concerned about cost versus people who are concerned about accessibility, fire safety, electrical safety, whatever. I think the people who are concerned about these things should be worried more about cost, frankly.
Just because you're from the US, the Ontario Building Code is actually one of the most restrictive building codes in the world, and we are, for some reason, proud of it. So just,
Yeah. I know on stairs, Canada is much worse than the United States.
We're on stairs, so the level at which you need a second stairway, we're the second worst in the world after Uganda. So that's a kind of a point of pride. We have a question here.
Hi, Nelma, question for you. Just given your experience in working with EHON, and just wanted to get your comments, because we talked about it this morning regarding the DC exemptions. I know right now the wording is up to 4 units, and the committee is doing a new study to put it to council for the first 4 being free. If you can just speak to that, but also in the context of whether it's a condo or a rental. Thanks.
I am probably not the expert to speak to development charges. I do agree that the irony of, MLI Select starts at 5 units, the development charges waiver is only up to 4 units, and with the development charges waiver, what a way to kill 5-plex, 6-plex, 7-plex, 8-plex, right? Which I think, by the way, I just quoted you, now that I'm thinking about it, yeah. And there is a difference, of course, between rental and condo, also with the GST, which is new, because before that, what I used to have my client do, just to not be under rental replacement, they just wrote everything as condo and kept the ownership just to stay away from rental. Now we have this shift toward rental, so I am not the one calculating the fees. I never, drove to City Hall with a really big check. I am not the expert to speak to that.
But just in the context of your experience working with EHON, what are you hearing or anything along those lines?
I am not hearing anything about development charges beyond the 4 unit that they have.
What I'll maybe add is what I have heard is that council recognizes that this current formulation, which is that 4 units in a building with 4 units are exempt, and if you build a 5th unit, then all units apply. They understand the disincentive that creates for building 5, 6, 7 unit buildings. So again, like rumor, talk around City Hall that this will be addressed. How, I'm not sure, but they at least recognize that this was probably not the right way to do it.
So I have talked with Councillor Bradford's office quite a few times on this, so they have actually gone to formulate, or trying to use a study to reevaluate it. Oh, sorry. To reevaluate it, and then they are waiting for that to be done, which I think they said is this quarter, and then it's supposed to go to committee. So it is formally acknowledged in process, but I was just curious if there's any update.
And what is the unit threshold that you think they're going to?
What I've heard is change the wording, because it was sort of a last-minute addition, right?
Yeah.
That was done at the last moment on council floor, is to do the first 4 free, then you pay. But I'm not 100% certain on that, but just my conversation.
That would make more
that's
sense.
the takeaway.
Yeah, it's like how we tax income, right? It's like there's marginal rates.
Yeah, and I don't mind paying for fair share, but even as we know, right, on condos especially, it's a $400,000 headwind, so thanks.
Yeah. Thank you.
Question for Nama on the major streets. When looking at sites, I noticed that there are a lot of corner lots where the address is actually on the side street. So I guess it would be like the side yard that would be on the major street. Would those be included? Do we know that?
That's That's a great question. I did have several sites that I worked on, and we could, for example, I was like on the corner of Young and something, and we were able to switch it so we would benefit from what Young Street allowed.
Oh, like switch the address.
Yeah, so you would say my main frontage is actually on Young Street, or by the way, that is also a good indicator. Where is the longer frontage?
Yeah. I'm thinking of ones where the longer one is
On the-
absolutely on the side street.
Okay.
Yeah. It's like a lot of corners, like deep lots.
Right. Because also with the laneway suites, for example, when you were on a corner and you could benefit from another street, so they let you have like different exemptions. I don't have an answer that I'm 100% certain, so write me an email, I will check, and I will reply to your email.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks.
I'm Stephen. Thank you for the presentation. My name is Richard. I work for the Ontario government for the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing. I did actually work on the code, so Stephen, I love the elevator presentation. And I'd like to ask, kind of with the increase of this mid-rise, missing middle construction, where do you move the needle on adding elevators to buildings that might not necessarily be viable now? So moving away from kind of the 3 to 4 elevator, taller condo buildings to more like what moves the needle on a building going from no elevator to an elevator?
Yeah, this threshold, this is a really interesting question. In Europe, I sometimes had a hard time getting architects to tell me what even the legal requirement was, because the standard is just like you're always going to have an elevator in an apartment building. In Switzerland, I've seen 2-unit buildings with elevators, and it's not legally required. And like that's where you ideally want to get, where developers like don't even do the math, and they're just like, everyone wants an elevator. Elevators are cheap. Let's build an elevator. In New York, developers will seek out whatever loopholes they can to avoid elevators in pretty much whatever buildings they can. I did do an analysis at about 24,000 square feet, which I guess would be, 2,400 square meters, is generally where they voluntarily start including elevators. That's like pretty large. That's a pretty big building without an elevator. I would guess it'll be pretty similar in Canada. In Seattle, Seattle allows single stair buildings, which means the buildings are pretty small. There's at most 4 units per story in those. That's the legal limit. And I have seen 6-story buildings without elevators. Not that common. Like usually they'll include an elevator starting around 5, maybe 6 stories. But you do see it. In Los Angeles now they've got some program called ED1 where you have to rent the units below market. But unlike with most affordable housing programs, there's no special design requirement to include an elevator. It's not that common, but I have seen buildings of 70 units without an elevator. So my guess is the New York one is probably the best, probably about 2,400 square meters, 24,000 square feet currently. But like I said, in Italy or in Switzerland, every apartment building is going to have an elevator. So if you can drive down the cost to get to that European cost, then the threshold is nothing. As long as it's a multi-unit building, it will have an elevator. But in the North American context, I would guess about 24,000 square feet, which is, 40 units, maybe something like that.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll do last question, and I'll just say, if there's anyone in the province that should read your report, it's Richard, so we'll make sure that he gets it.
Awesome.
Hi, just another question on elevators. So you mentioned that the costs in Europe is about 1/3 of what it is in North America, but also in Europe they have a lot more elevators per 1,000 residents than North America. But what's the total expenditure on elevators? Is it roughly the same, or is it more or less?
Yeah. So interestingly, it seems to be 2% pretty much everywhere. Like 2% of the cost of construction is elevators pretty much anywhere. So, returning to my mother's building in Bucharest. Her building is 5 stories. My building is 5 stories. My building doesn't have an elevator. Hers does. I'm guessing hers is about, it's about 2% of the cost of construction. And in mine, I think it would be between 5 and 10% of the cost of construction. So they didn't add one. So yeah. It's about 2% of the building. I did look at like what the total elevator industry claims its contribution to GDP is, and it's about the same in the United States at least and in Europe, which suggests that developers don't end up saving money by building fewer elevators. In some cases, maybe they do. One elevator, so the cost will be 1/3. But in most cases, they just build way more elevators. So. And this has like benefits with reliability. Like elevators tend to break down per use. So if you have 1/3 of the units off of the same elevator, it'll probably break down 1/3 of the time that it would in North America. I know in Ontario and British Columbia as well, you have like a terrible problem of elevator ratios, and you can have some buildings with 150 units per elevator. I suspect that's actually more of a planning issue than a cost issue, but it might be. These like horrible wait times that you see for elevator, you'd never see that in Europe. You would never be waiting, 5-10 minutes to ride an elevator in an apartment building in Europe because you'd have 16 units sharing an elevator or something like that. So yeah, it's at the end of the day, the developers are probably not going to save money overall, but they will be building more elevators, building types of buildings that have more family-sized units because, they're sort of point access blocks rather than these double-loaded corridors, fewer windowless bedrooms, et cetera. So I would say, yeah, the benefits are really quality, not cost at the end of the day.
Okay, so with that, thank you once again to Nama Blonder and Stephen Smith.